Hi, welcome. Today is August 2nd, 2021, and today we're going to be going over the Implant Introduction and getting a deeper dive for our LMS module breakouts. So with that, let's begin. Awesome. So I have some vocab written up. I'm just going to kind of go through some of the terms, and then we're going to do a deep dive and breakdown of non-locking, locking, and then product families and terminology, how it relates to a customer. Maybe it has a different definition than what it literally means, but customers communicate in such a way. I'm going to be focusing more on customer communication and how when you get on the phones that vocab is going to be relating to you. So I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit, but cancellous, this term is really a bone. It's a soft bone, and then when there's a type of bone cortical, it's going to be a denser bone. But as far as our terminology goes, typically when you hear the word cortical, a customer means non-locking. It's a non-locking screw. There are locking screws, which is just a thread around the head of the screw. Those do go into cortical bone, so that can be misleading. But when you hear a customer on the phone, typically we always associate cortical with non-locking, and we always ask, do you mean a non-locking or a locking screw? When they say cortical, 95% of the time it's non-locking. And then we have some characteristics of a screw. Is it regular or is it self-tapping? A regular screw is going to have no cutting flutes, and I do have some screws on the table that you guys are welcome to look at. There's going to be no cutting flute. A self-tapping screw is going to have a cutting flute. And then there is a recess. Is that recess either star, hex, or cruciform? Those are the three recesses that we sell for our screws, and we'll look into which screws that applies for or is applicable for. And then we start to get into some of our product families, where that terminology falls within the SKU and the product line itself. So we have our Swiss line of implants, we have our VOI style, which has been renamed to Legacy, we have single threaded implants, we have double threaded implants, we have proprietary halo, we also have auto locking, but I'm not going to be covering that in today's training. And then we have alloys. Is it either a titanium alloy or is it stainless? Stainless is our most common alloy that we sell. It's a 316 LBM, medical grade. Cool. So with that, let's kind of start to take it and introduce it to non-locking application. So we're going to be taking the screws and breaking them down into product families and what differentiates a product from another. So with VOI, we're really a great vendor to be able to fill any hole when you're coming from any competitor. So that's what really separates VOI from other competitors, is that we'll carry a product line that could be compatible with any kind of vendor that comes to us, whereas the majority of vendors only sell their one cortical screw, their one locking system, and when you go to them, that's all that you can get. So we're going to break down why do we have so many options. So we have the Legacy or the VOI style, and then we have the Swiss. When we're talking about non-locking cortical screws, we have a lot of different options as far as kind of our characteristics of a screw. It's either the recess or the cutting flutes that we're really getting down to. For the rest of these examples, I'm going to be speaking about stainless until I specifically say I'm speaking in titanium. So all the SKUs you're going to be seeing are stainless related. So for the characteristics of a SKU or a screw, both, I'm going to be asking what the recess is and what the cutting flute is. Is there a cutting flute or is it regular? And those two things are going to indicate what SKU I am looking at between what product line. So with the Legacy line, and actually let me back it up a little bit and go over implant sizes. So an implant range is going to relate to the weight of the patient, and depending on the surgery, if it's a fracture, the location. Currently right now, VOI is able to accommodate 1.0 to 5.0 implants. Not for every surgery, but for the majority of our double threaded line we can accommodate, and we'll look at this in a closer deep dive in just a moment. For right now, for our cortical screws, we're going to be focusing on the 1.5 through 3.5 series for this following example. So for your Legacy screws and your Swiss screws, back in the day, VOI says, okay, we are going to go after the competitor. And the competitor that we're talking about when we say Swiss is going to be Johnson & Johnson or Synthes. That's who we're speaking about. And so back in the day, when we're just talking about non-locking implants, they're selling 1.5, 2.0, 2.4, 2.7, and 3.5 implants. And so when we're looking at recesses, just recesses, the Swiss line was being sold in cruciform for these sizes. Whether it was self-tapping or regular, the cutting flutes, either way, that was your screw recess. And your 2735 was hex. Whether it's self-tapping or regular. And again, that's just the cutting flute at the bottom of your screw. So when BOI is like, okay, we're gonna go after that business, we're gonna combat that business, we're gonna also offer those size screws. But we're gonna change it up for preference. And so, if we have a customer who is using a full range of implants, meaning a whole slew of implant sizes because they're seeing so many patients come through the door, and they're using cruciform for their smaller sizes, they're having to change out drivers and packs and different things relating to your implant size, and they were going hex for their 2735. So VOI said, okay, we're gonna release screws from our VOI legacy line, but if our Swiss line, and Johnson & Johnson is selling separately their own line, and we take on a line, that's our Swiss line, these follow the recesses, this is about to follow the screw, we're gonna release the VOI style and the opposite of what Swiss has, meaning all of VOI's screws are hex recess for the corticals. In just the legacy series right now, we're gonna talk about star and double threaded in a moment. We're only talking about hex, cruciform, and non-locking implants at this time. So hex and hex. So if you're going through the VOI catalog and you want to order a Swiss screw that is cruciform, and we're going to use 10 millimeter as the example, you're looking at a starting screw skew like this one. So now we're going to kind of break it down. The 150 or any of the 200, 240, 270, 350 onward of the VOI screws, skews, for any product family, it's going to depict the implant itself. The 150 means it's a 1.5 millimeter implant. The 10 in the back means it's the millimeter length of the screw. So this is always going to be the implant size, and this is going to be the millimeter length of that screw. Now, if we know and we kind of think back about what are the characteristics of our skew or our screw itself, beyond the size and the length of the product, it's what's the recess and what's self-tapping. If I'm looking at a Swiss code and I want it to be a non-self-tapping, no cutting flutes, I'm gonna put an REG in the front, REG. This exact skew into the system means I'm sending you a non-self-tapping screw that is a 1.5 in implant size, that's 10 millimeters long. If I want to sell you a self-tapping screw that does have cutting flutes, it is going to have an ST in the front. ST for self-tapping, it's a 1.5 and it's 10 millimeters long. In the Swiss family, these codes automatically mean it's cruciform because they only come in the recess and 1.52024 as cruciform. So if I'm looking at the same set of codes and I'm going to the VOI product line and I want a code that is non-self-tapping and it is a regular screw that's cruciform, it doesn't exist, haha. But if it's hex, this is what it looks like. It's exactly like that. But if I want a VOI screw code that is self-tapping, I'm going to end a T. I'm going to end the screw code in a T. So these are 4 active product codes in our system right now. You could sell 4 of any of these to a customer, but they all represent something different. VOI screws are only available in a hex recess. If you want it to be a regular non-self-tapping, no cutting flutes, the code is as stands. If you wanted a hex screw that is self-tapping, you can only get that in the VOI style with a T at the end. That's going to signify your self-tapping. Typically with VOI screw codes, the majority of stuff is kind of happening in the back half of the code. And then with Swiss style screws, it's typically happening in the front half of the code. But you can always look back on your catalog, and in your catalog page, it will show you what's compatible, the recess, and all of the characteristics if it's regular or not, if it's self-tapping. Okay, so this is going to be cruciform, regular, cruciform, self-tapping. Does anyone have any questions at this time? Okay, and we can all understand what these 4 differences are by just looking at the screw code. We understand. Okay, cool. Okay. So we're going to kind of continue on, and we're going to look a little bit more at our 2735 series. So I lost my, here we go. Okay. So back in the day, when VOI was selling a full range, including 2735, we see some overlap. So VOI is really good about filling in the gaps. And so we fill in the gaps because we sell hex screws when the Swiss style product family only has cruciform. So for driver preference for a doctor, they could have all of their screws in one recess. But when you look at the legacy line in the 27 and 35, and you look at the Swiss line in 27 and 35, they're both hex. So we used to have screw codes that were just like what we just saw, with a T at the end and everything. But it's really the same exact SKU as this. They're all the same millimeter, they're all the same length, they're all the same self-tapping cutting flue, and they're all the same recess. So what VOI did is they discontinued that product line. So we no longer have a VOI legacy line in 27 and 35. If you have a customer who is ordering all hex recess screws in a full range of implants, meaning 15, 20, 24, 27, 35, their product history would look like this for their screw codes. If they were a self-tapping customer, there would be a T at the end of every code. And so if you want a full line, I'm going to just assume we're talking in self-tapping right now, of hex self-tapping cortical screws, this is what this would look like for the purchase history. We do not sell cruciform screws higher than a 2-4 implant size. At that point, it's either hex or star. Okay, do we have any questions? All right, cool. We're gonna move on to locking in just a moment, but I wanna look a little bit more into titanium versus stainless and some of those key differences. So let's build it out. 2-4 is where we really see the most kind of in 2-7 in titanium, and that's because it relates to a TTA implant, and TTA implants we see the most titanium application. So if we're looking at let's go ahead and make it another 10. If we're looking at 2 screw codes and we want to know the difference between the 2 relating to titanium, we're typically looking for a TI. TI is going to signify the titanium. So TIST24010, it's a titanium screw. It's a 2-4 and it's 10 millimeters long. What do we think that this recess is for this screw? Because it's from the Swiss family, and regardless of the alloy, they don't have what recess? Yes, so this is going to be? Cruciform. Yes, cruciform, perfect. But if we look at VOI, and we know that the rule with VOI is that we fill in the gaps, what would make the recess of this screw? So at that point, it's just preference for their doctor of what their driver that they're using within surgery. So with titanium, again, this is a seat where there's always an exception to every rule at VOI, and this is kind of one of them. I did say the majority of the VOI screw codes have the information in the back. With titanium, it's going to be in the front of the SKU. And it actually might not even be a TI. I think it actually just might be a T itself. But you can always look at the product description or your catalog when you're saying, okay, I'm looking at a product's purchase history, or a customer's purchase history. They're trying to order this screw. Which one do they want? Let me use my tools. Let me look in the catalog. Let me see what driver they have in their history. What did they order the most often? And then I can always check the RMA portal. Did they actually return one of those screws, and what was the reason? Oops, wrong recess. Now I know I need to make sure I send the correct recess screw. Okay, any questions? Awesome. All right, cool. So now we're going to look into a little bit more of non-locking versus locking, and to piggyback off of where we're going, Cancellous doesn't come in locking. I just want to make sure I'm correct when I say that. And typically screws that are cancellous actually say the word can in them. So if it's self-tapping, it would be like a can self-tapping 350. If it's non-self-tapping, it would just be can 350. If it's from the VOI products code, it could be 350 with a CT at the end. Or there could be a CPT, which stands for cancellous partial thread. That's a future training, separate, talk about it kind of with fractures. But just know the same application goes for cancellous screws. What the difference is, why there's different ones, and then the characteristics of it. Learning the characteristics of any SKU with VOI is going to be beneficial for your training. We're about to see that with plates, we see it with screws, and then especially suture when we get to that training. Learning what the code means and relating it to the description is very helpful. Okay, cool. So let's look at single threaded and kind of the progression of non-locking to locking. So back in the day, they say, okay, we have implants, we have technology, but how can we make it better? There was non-locking implants, and then locking gets introduced. Then they say locking is working great. How can we make it even better? And so then they release what we now coin as double-threaded locking, which then forced us to kind of coin single-threaded locking, which is going to be the first generation of locking. Then we have the second, which we now call double-threaded. At the time of August 2nd of the recording, this is what we're calling these lines, but I believe these are going to be rebranded, so there could be an addendum in the future as to what this technology gets to be called, but as of right now, standing, this is what it is. So non-locking is everything that we've discussed. Non-locking screws are going to go in non-locking plates. Locking is meaning a thread pattern. There's screws and plates in front of Ashley, and if you look at them, there's going to be a thread pattern on the screw, there's going to be a thread pattern in the plate. Those are going to engage together, they're going to lock. Non-locking implants traditionally locked by just the plate contact with the bone, and the screw is what's holding that plate together. In a locking construct, you have the bone and the plate, but you also have the screw locked into the plate itself, which is going to keep the implant together. So the majority of our customer base is in a locking system, and it's going to be the double-threaded system. But we do have a full line of implants because, again, VOI wants to be able to service any customer. And when locking was introduced and then double-threaded locking was introduced, a lot of our customers went ahead and upgraded their implants and their systems and their packs to be the latest and greatest. But we also have a lot of surgeons who are close to retiring or are just not in a position right now that their volume and caseload warrants that they would put an investment to transition to locking implants. So we still service all three of these implant lines I'm about to review with you. So non-locking is typically like DCP plates. And if we're talking about TPLO plates, at the time of this recording, we do have a launch of plates coming. We can only service one TPLO plate, and it's going to be the NXT. Your starting SKU is going to be an N. And I'll just kind of put a little TPLO notation here. This will get more elaborate as we go down the series, but after non-locking, we release single thread. Single-threaded implants are only available in the following implant sizes: 1.5, 2.7, and 3.5. They are only available in hex. And they are all cutting because every locking screw is a self-tapping or has a cutting flute. I think I'm going to change out cutting for self-tap. A little more on brand. ST. ST in VOI's terminology does not stand for single threaded. So be cautious to never use ST as an abbreviation for single thread. It means to everyone else self-tapping. That's just always how we've trained on it. And all of our screws signify in the SKU that it's ST for self-tapping, not single thread. What did I just say? I already broke the rule. Self-tapping. Okay. So codes that are screws that are going to be single threaded are notated by LHST. If it is a screw, it's going to follow the same pattern as our cortical screws. So the 100 series followed by whatever the millimeter length is. The LHST is what defines this as a single threaded system. I believe it actually stands for locking head self-tapping, but I know that staff will say to themselves locking hex self-tapping to kind of think about that recess and that it's only available in hex. A downside to this system is that out of a full range of availability of what we know can accommodate a patient, only 1.5, 2.7, and 3.5 are available to lock. So if you had a 2.0 or a 2.4 or a larger dog and you want to lock, what are you going to do? If you're in the single threaded system, there is nothing you can do. But these codes are going to be compatible with any fracture plates that only have an LLC without a DT. You will never see a DT in a single threaded code, and we'll get into that in a moment. LLC. And this is from the Swiss line. I'll make a note. If it's from the VOI legacy line, it is going to have an L, just an L in the front. An example would look like this, 8.0 ton. Whereas a non-locking VOI fracture code would just have the 8.010. There would be no L. Since I kind of brought up two differences between fracture, I want to quickly add that the way that you can tell the difference in a non-locking plate skew between Swiss and Legacy is going to be the implant size versus the millimeter width of the plate. And so if you look in your catalogs, it's going to be in the trauma and fracture section. There's a difference between the Swiss style fracture plates and the Legacy style. There's two main technical differences, but for right now, because we're really focusing more on screw, skew, and differences within those ranges, what that difference is. So in the Swiss style of fracture plates, it's going to be it's going to be defined by the size of the implant. And so what I mean by that is the LLC 3.510 NCP is a locking low contact 3.5 millimeter 10 hole plate that's narrow and it's a compression plate. If I wanted the VOI equivalent, I want to say it's a 10.0, and it's embarrassing if I get this wrong, but let's go ahead and go L 10.0 10. So VOI style plates go by the width of the implant of the plate itself. So all 3.5 millimeter fracture plates are 10 millimeters wide. 10 millimeter wide implants except 3.5 millimeter screws. So that was how VOI was able to separate the plate skews from the the Swiss line that we already had. So 10.0, 10, 3.5, 10. Width of the plate, size of the implant. Okay, so that's what that would look like locking. We're going to erase that example now. Okay. If we're talking about TPLO plates and their compatibility, these are going to also be signified by an L. So it would be L35 followed by a left or a right, which is how you know a TPLO plate difference versus a fracture difference. A TPLO plate will have an orientation, a fracture will have a number of holes. Okay. Do we have any questions so far? Okay. So these are the compatible screws to the compatible plate starting skews. So after single threaded, we have a little caveat, and that caveat is called halo. And this is kind of like a little side note on our way to the double threaded. Double threaded is meat and potatoes, bringing everyone around for dinner table. I was going to say Halo is an appetizer, but it's not even that. It's a distraction. So Halo is a proprietary implant system. When you hear Halo, it means it's compatible with NGD. This system used to be called our New Jersey line, and that's because NGD is based out of New Jersey, and so we were kind of playing off of terms. The AO or Johnson & Johnson based out of Swiss. It's kind of the play on words. So Halo means it's going to be NGD compatible, which is a proprietary implant system that is also single threaded. This implant system is available in 2.0, 2.4, 2.7, and 3.5. When it was first released, they only were selling 2.7.3.5, and we were selling the compatible 2.0, 2.4 equipment prior to NGD actually releasing their own 2.0, 2.4 set. So we were selling additional sizes for this implant system before they picked it up. Proprietary is always kind of a danger zone because if there's ever a back order, what are you going to do? And you also want to be very conscious of compatibility. You cannot mix and match any implants from the single threaded line, from the Halo line, or the double threaded line, as a clear rule of thumb. There's an exception to the rule that we might discuss, but probably not. Just to keep it nice and safe and clean, none of the implant lines should be mixed. If you did mix an NGD implant with a Johnson & Johnson implant, it will back out. It will not work. It will feel like it will lock, but as soon as weight is placed on that implant, it will back out and fail. The Halo line is going to have the word Halo in it. It will have an LST with an asterisk, or it will just be an H in the case of TPLO. And these go with the LST screws. So fracture typically will say like Halo LLC, or I don't know if they could just go Halo into the implant size itself. I think it has some additional terms. LST with an asterisk. If there is no asterisk and it's just an LST, I do believe those codes don't exist anymore, but if you don't have the asterisk, you might be in a single threaded system, so you just have to double check. We don't have as many of these plates anymore, so it's probably either going to be a Halo specific or a TPLO plate with an H to signify. We don't have as many customers really in this Halo base. You really shouldn't run into it very often, and if you do, you'll have a complete purchase history to work off of when you're communicating with customers. But that transition brings us to double threaded. So double threaded is where star comes into play, our additional recess. And it's our highest seller. It's what we onboard at CEs. It's what the guy down the street's using. All the new product releases are going to be associated to double threaded. Awesome. Okay, so this implant size is available in the largest series, 1.5, 2.0, 2.4, 2.7, 3.5, 4.0, 5.0. We call this a universal system, like a fully universal system, but it doesn't mean universal in the sense that if you have a 1.5 case, you can use your 3.5 implants. They have to be still specific to the implant case itself. But no matter what patient that walks through your door, you're going to be able to accommodate within some type of locking fixation system that is consistent with your other packs. That's really what we mean by that. You're not going to pull out your 3.5 pack and see something different than when you pull out your 1.5 pack. It's just going to be sized accordingly. You always need, when you're locking, your locking drill guide. You need to make sure you have your cortical drill bit, and if your locking screw requires a different drill bit like it does in the 3.5 series, that you have the appropriate 2 drill bits, you have a driver, those key pieces that are required to be able to place your locking screw. So those are going to be the same pieces required per implant pack per size. So you have the largest range of availability, and then the same way technology was looked at, recesses over time have been looked at. And the star recess is supposed to strip less, and that makes sense. If you think about a star shape, it's going to have points, and if you think about a hex, it's going to be more of like a circle recess, or you could see stripping out occurring more easily than having these points that your driver's going to really fixate on. You can strip drivers out by over torquing them, so if someone's power driving and they're giving that shaft too much power, things like that could strip out the recess of your screw itself, which is not going to be able to go into the animal, or vice versa. When you're doing an implant removal, it's going to be really hard to get the stripped screw out. But these are the implant sizes they're available in, and we have them in star. If we star is only available these screws and self-tapping. So all of their codes will have an SST in the front. For your cortical screws, it's going to change. So this is just going to be applicable for your 4050. So it's just going to be applicable for your 1.5 through your 3.5 for your star cortical screws. Star locking screws are going to just add an S in front of our LHST. The same way we just added an S in front of our ST. For the compatible plates, actually, let me add, with the transition of implants and non-locking, we see kind of the emerge of cruciform to hex. And then in single threaded, they keep with that hex recess. And then with double threaded, we introduce star. But we're VOI, and we want to be able to accommodate customers in some way to make that conversion easier. And if you're converting from an LHST single thread system to double threaded and you are using hex, you have hex drivers, maybe you want to keep your hex drivers and be able to reuse them. Same with the concept of halo. If you're transitioning out of the halo system and into the DT system, you were in a hex recess. These are only available in hex. I should have added that, halo only in hex. That we decided to manufacture hex double threaded screws. So if you want a hex double threaded screw, you're just going to throw an H in the front. We've had some of the trainees say, oh, I can remember that it's a double threaded screw because there's 2 letters on either side, if that helps you. And kind of just shows like hex locking head, and that is not hex locking hex. It's a hex locking head. But if it's easier for you to remember the LHST as locking hex, please by all means. And for your compatible plates, I used to be able to say this as a rule of thumb, so now you kind of just have to look and inquire in the product, but at one point, any double threaded plate had a DT in it, so DT LLC for fracture. Again, we try to make this really simple for customers. A lot of our competitors just go off of numbers for SKUs, so for example, like 31901 is a VOI product code, but it also is a J&J code that relates to a depth gauge. 31901 doesn't tell me it's a depth gauge, I just know that from memory. But if I'm looking at VOI product SKUs, DT, double threaded, L, locking, LC, low compact, you can depict what that code actually means. And that's really helpful. But then they released, for example, our multi-purpose plates. Those right now are by a code that looks like 20NP49. That's a double threaded plate that doesn't have a DT in it. So you just have to kind of look at what's available and stay on top of the product releases that come out, but DT. If we're talking about another style of DT plate that we have, it's going to have a C in the front. I didn't bring the 2 different examples with me. My case is traveling back from Arizona right now, but one of the fracture plates on the table is the CDT. I did go over this in the general overview that was watched prior to this training to visually show the differences, but again, I can touch on it. DT stands for double threaded locking low compact. There is no compression achievable in this plate. They're just going to be stacked locking holes. The CDT plate is going to allow you to offer compression. It's going to be that figure 8 hole. So that's the difference between those 2 plates. The C in the front stands for compression, really. As a side note, the 3.5 implant size is the only fracture plate series that you have to think about, is it a narrow plate or a broad plate? If a customer doesn't specify in a 3.5 series narrow or broad, the standard is narrow. Broad is almost like a specialty. It's a thicker patient, bigger, wider. So that's just kind of a rule of thumb. If we ever get hung up, just call and ask and make sure we can always clarify, but typically it means narrow. If we're talking about TPLO plates, an X will signify the NXT series and an ET will signify the Elite series. We will have TPLO as its own training and fracture as well to kind of really get into the differences between these plates. As of this time, VOI is only carrying the NXT series and the Elite series. NXT has a different distal end configuration, as well as the Elite, and this is in a matte finish, this is in a stainless. This was also briefly discussed in the product overview. And we are releasing 2 additional TPLO plates, so we will see additional SKUs that do not have a DT that are double threaded. So again, you just have to use your resources to look at them, but as of right now, that's what those are going to look like. We do have TPO low plates in a full range. I use 3.5 as an example a lot, but you would just switch out any of the implant sizes to get the appropriate size implant for that next size down. Okay, cool. Let's see if I'm thinking around and making sure that I'm not missing any additional SKUs that are really obvious. I think we're okay. Awesome. Okay, do we have any questions so far? No? Okay, cool. Well, I think that is a really good introduction into the implants and what's the differences between why VOI has so many SKUs and how to look at them, break it down, and say this is why we have this and associate it to a customer's product history and or description to get them what they need. Future trainings that we will have will be more specific to TPO low, more specific to fracture, getting into them and their differences. But overall, this was a general overview for our different product families and terminology that you'll be hearing as you get closer to phones. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.